Today we're going to talk about some of the top 10 risks posed to CI/CD and pipelines. Thank you for the introductions. I'll talk a tiny bit about me. So I've had a career of over 27 years in building and helping secure systems. The first half of my career was building systems as a developer and a systems engineer. Second half of my career, I pivoted to full-time security, primarily application security, anything code related, also cloud security. But just a fun fact, I like a lot of things. So I also have been teaching network security for about 20 years at a local college in Vancouver. I'm from Vancouver, Canada, by the way. Beautiful place, highly encourage you to visit. We have the OWASP AppSec Pacific Northwest Conference that happens in the Pacific Northwest, goes between Vancouver, Portland, Seattle, and Victoria. Aside from that, I run a couple of companies, Forward Security, Eureka DevSecOps. I worked at a bunch of places, I teach, and as mentioned, I contribute to OWASP and B-Sides Vancouver, and do a lot of different things. By the way, my passion, and aside from software and security, is also music. I collect records. If you want to talk about that, come talk to me after. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk a bit about the current CI/CD landscape, what's happening in the world today. A lot has changed over the time that I've been involved in building and securing systems. Then we're going to deep dive into the top 10 CI/CD security risks according to OWASP. And it's worth also mentioning that Cameron here in the audience and myself have kicked off a new OWASP project focusing on this topic. It's called the Secure Pipeline Verification Standard, aligned with the Application Security Verification Standard, also known as ASVS. Our goal is to bring something similar to ASVS for CI/CD security risks, where there's an explicit list of controls that are easy to verify and implement and verify by those who want to secure their pipelines. And then we'll finish off by talking about some key takeaways. So, humans have evolved, and soon there's going to be robot hybrids. Software development has evolved quite a bit since my time. Started building software back in the late 90s, not to date myself, but a lot has changed. Back in the day, we built software according to waterfall, or as Tanya called it, water fail. The other day, which I really like, that was my life. We worked in waterfall development models at the companies that I worked at. And then in and around the late 2000s, I think it was around 2010, where we saw a major shift from waterfall to agile. And that was pretty revolutionary, right? Whereas with waterfall, it's more like a long marathon that you're participating at. With agile, it's more like in sprints. So it's a totally different ballgame. You have smaller sprints, and that's how you do things. And then, as we moved on in the 2010s, DevOps came along, and that also changed a lot of things in how we build and secure software. It was quite challenging. So I remember, I was working at HSBC, and the company was like, hey, now we're doing agile development, and we don't really know how to do security as a part of it. So Farshad, why don't you take a couple of your guys and take some of these projects that are flagship for us and try out how we could incorporate security into this new agile development practice that we're about to embark on. So we took a couple of our flagship teams and tried different methodologies to see what works and what doesn't. And it's important to note that one of the biggest differences between waterfall and agile was incorporating automation, right? CI/CD. I mean, what agile did is brought the development team closer to the customer. The ops team was still out there, like there was still a wall between them, but at least developers came closer to the client, and CI/CD and automation was a big part of agile. And DevOps built on that, and they're like, well, hey, the ops team is left out in the party, they're feeling lonely, let's bring them into the party, and now we have DevOps. So the dev and the ops team are working very closely to the client in an iterative manner, and building further on that CI/CD concept. So DevOps took that further. So all of these things presented a lot of security challenges. The term DevSecOps didn't exist when we were embarking in this particular journey back, I think it was about 10 years ago at the bank. So a lot of lessons learned, and the evolution and expansion of CI/CD is quite exciting, but it definitely comes with a lot of risks. And of course, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. So you got to keep that in mind. And just as there are challenges with securing DevOps and agile practices, there's also opportunities, right? Whenever there's a challenge, there's an opportunity for improvement. And if you can do it right, then there's a lot to be benefited from. So that's how the world has changed, and that's where we are today in 2024. And so what do we do? So just before I go into the depth of it, a few bad things have happened, right? We had the solar winds issue, I think it was December 2020, around that time. I'm going to talk a bit about that. We had the CodeCov problem. We had the Travis CI. I'm going to use those examples throughout this presentation. Dependency confusion came up. There's lots of interesting things have happened that we're going to dissect. And at a high level, each of these represent different types of problems with CI/CD pipelines in terms of security and things that we can do to mitigate these in the future. I think the CodeCov one happened in so that SolarWinds was December 2021. CodeCov was sometime early, 2020, 2021, and that happened also in 2020. February 2021 was the first dependency confusion instance. I think it was a guy that did some research, and then he demonstrated that it's possible. Then attackers went to town and took that further. So we'll talk about that as well. So let's get down to the top 10 CI/CD security risks according to OWASP. Now, they published this a couple of years ago, which was great. And I remember right around that time, we had a client that got their CI/CD pipelines got compromised. Now, this was a client that we were doing deep application pen testing for them every year. We were helping them with some other practices. And we didn't really think that pipelines could be a point of attack, right? And I was looking at stats, and that's actually on a rise. What's happening is a lot of people historically focused on securing their infrastructure, right? Like, I mean, I've been in this game for, like I said, quite a while. And infrastructure was a thing. You secured your perimeter, you put a firewall, and that's what you did. And pen testing was a thing. You pen tested infrastructure, great. Then AppSec came about, right? We're like, hey, we got to secure the applications. Back in the day, in the 90s, not a lot of people had apps that were exposed to the outside world. So securing your perimeter was fine. But as we went into the 2000s, companies started to have APIs. Heaven forbid, even the bank, which was, we exposed APIs to the outside world. And that was a thing that you just never did. Like, I remember when I started the bank, we didn't expose anything to the outside world. But in the mid-2010s, we had to. I mean, as we went into 2016 and 2017, we were mandated through Open Banking Initiative in EU to actually expose our APIs to the outside world. And that was a huge shift in the way we thought about security. And that's where zero trust and a lot of these other concepts came about. So it's important to really think about these. And what's happened is that because we've been focusing our perimeter and in the last 10 years paying more attention to the actual application itself, not to say that we've done a great, perfect job, but we've done a decent job securing them. But the pipelines is something we haven't really focused on, right? And attackers are finding that as an opportunity to get in. I think Jeff Williams calls that the software factory. It's the thing, you probably all have heard of Jeff Williams, founder of OWASP and one of the co-founders of OWASP Top 10, even ASVS, right? A lot of contributions to the OWASP community, and I'm grateful for what he's done. And he coined the term the software factory. So you got the application itself, but then you got all the people and the tools that build that software. That part has been neglected. So attackers are like, hey, great opportunity. We're going to come through the software factory, particularly the CI/CD pipelines, and gain access to your system. So that healthcare client called me up. They're like, yeah, we got breached through the pipelines. And I'm like, okay, this is going to happen more and more. And then, of course, it did. And we're seeing a lot of that. And in fact, there are very few companies that even do pen testing on CI/CD pipelines. I know there are a few that they do out there, and that's something that we're looking into doing. But I think it's really important for all of you that are using pipelines to do some sort of a check on it and either leverage this OWASP Top 10 list or the SPVS, which will come out soon, to make sure that you've done the right level of security. So for each of these top 10 items, I'm going to talk a bit about what it is. We'll talk about an example and ways that you could mitigate that issue from happening to you. All right, number one. Insufficient flow control mechanisms. So why does flow control matter, right? So what does that mean? I mean, in a pipeline, there's a flow of steps and things that happen. And you got to have the right controls and checks and balances across that pipeline, right? One of the most important things is a manual code review, right? Like it's common that you put a gate so that when someone does a PR, you do a manual code review on it. So some companies don't have that. I've seen that. The ones that they do, a lot of times the team lead just looks at it like, I don't have time, they just click OK. A lot of times they don't even read it or comment it. That's not what you should be doing, right? I mean, that gate is really important. So what happened in the SolarWinds attack? How many of you remember the SolarWinds attack? I just want to see. Okay, everybody, pretty much, right? Who can tell me what happened? Anyone want to raise their hand? Go for it.
Yeah, they outsourced a big chunk of that platform to Belarus and didn't check to see who was on Belarus payrolls.
There you go, right? So those malicious people had access to repository. It was an Orion product. They modified the code, and then code just went through the pipelines, right? Got signed, packaged, delivered to their clients. So how could we have prevented that? And that happened in December, I think it was in December 2020. And that was actually one of the pushes for the US executive order, right? In 2021, there was that executive order that really focused on that software supply chain, mandating a lot of things that are great news to me, because those things were not really mandated before. Now, if you want to sell to the US government, you have to do a whole bunch of things around software security, and this was one of the drivers for that. So, not so great. What about CodeCov? Anyone remember the CodeCov breach? Not many people. Who knows what CodeCov is? Okay, so CodeCov, Felipe knows, awesome. What is CodeCov?
It's a code coverage tool that shows how your tests are covering your code.
Yes, exactly. So you can run this in your pipeline and figure out the code coverage and all that kind of stuff, right? The way it runs is it's got an agent that you can run in your pipeline, and it does a whole bunch of analysis, and then it pushes it up, and so on and so forth. So what happened is this Docker container that CodeCov was using had some secrets embedded in there. So attackers downloaded the Docker container, found the secrets, logged into the repository where the bash uploader script was, modified that bash uploader script. And what does that bash uploader script do? What that script did, it would run within your build runner or the build agent in your CI/CD, and then it would then, after the analysis was done with the code coverage, it would upload that stuff back into the CodeCov servers where the further analysis could be done. Except that bash uploader script is running in your build runner and gets what else is available to that, environment variables. What do those environment variables have? Well, they could have credentials to log into your repository. So that's exactly what they did, is once they modified that bash uploader script, every CodeCov client that was running that script within the agent in their pipelines, that uploader script had access to all the environment variables in the runner. So now all of the CodeCov's clients' environment variables were exposed. This bash uploader script uploaded all of that back into the attacker. That's really bad, right? So what could be done to deal with those? So these examples highlight how important some of these issues were. And in order to prevent that, manual code review would be one thing that you could do. So if you have the various gates that you put in your pipeline, for example, if you did a code review, maybe you would have found out, like a proper one, what has been checked in and whether that's going to do something malicious or not. But putting other gates as well, like running certain tools on there. I don't know if in the case of some of these examples, an automated security scanner would have helped. Probably the biggest control would be some sort of a review. But it's important to make sure that you're considering the gates and you have the right, I guess, security controls within the flow of your pipeline. So, and of course, throughout this session, I'm going to keep repeating that it's important for teams to look at lessons learned, right? It's important to, when these things happen, to get together as a team and say, hey, could this happen to us, right? I know at our company, every couple of weeks we have a team meeting, we look at what happened in the news, we talk about it internally, understand what's going on, and we take that lesson to our clients. And I think all teams should do something like that. So, number 2. Inadequate identity and access management. Okay, so in March 2021, the PHP Git server was compromised, right? That sounds really bad. This resulted in an attempted backdoor insertion into the PHP source code. They found out about it pretty quickly, so attackers didn't go too far, but they didn't just brute force their way in. What they did is they probably exploited a weakness in PHP's server-side identity access management. I think what happened there was that they got access to someone's credentials. It was the details are not fully disclosed. It was either that it was an offline attack, they got a hold of a username password database, or a particular user's account. So once they had that, they just logged in. And they were able to do their damage and insert their malicious code. So what could have happened? How could we have prevented this? Number one, why was PHP running their own Git server, right? Like that is not something you should do. There's GitHub, it has MFA, so even if the user credentials get compromised, you still have multi-factor authentication. So we need to enforce strict, authentication controls, and making sure that, obviously weak passwords are not there and whatnot, but really having multi-factor authentication. And beyond that, principal least privilege, all that kind of stuff, but don't run your own Git server if you don't have to, right? Because then you have to harden it and a lot of other things that could be problematic. But if they were using GitHub, then we'd have been able to have stronger identity access management controls rather than rolling their own Git server. So yeah, make sure that, again, you dissect these things with your team and understand them, and that this hopefully doesn't happen to you. This dependency chain of use or dependency confusion attack. Yeah, I mean, I think how many folks understand this? Just want to see a show of hands. Okay, about half of the room. So basically the idea is that, let's say you have a dependency in your project, right? And it's, but what happens is usually the package gets fetched from a public repo before the default configuration. A lot of these package managers is go and look at the public place. If you find it, use it, and then if not, use the private one, right? So that order of grabbing packages, if the attacker knows the name of your package, they'll go and create a malicious one that has the same name, and because of the order that you fetch the packages, it'll of course go out there and go, oh yeah, there it is, that package, and it fetches it, and it will use that, right? So what you want to do is you want to change the default configurations in your package manager, not to check the external sources first, right? To make sure that they're checking your dependency artifact repository and fetch it from there, rather than just going out to the internet and doing that. So make sure that you scrutinize every package and that your build system is fetching the right one from the right place, and the defaults are set in that way. And make sure that you're applying other things like, I don't know if signatures will help in this case, but you got to verify the checksums and make sure it's the package that, the checksum is valid and things like that. But primarily make sure that the order that you fetch the dependencies is correct and you're not getting them from an outside source. Oops. Right, what happened here? So yeah, I mean, this happened in NPM packages. This happened in many places. So I think when that researcher was doing it, he demonstrated on a bunch of companies, and then attackers went and did that attack to Amazon, Lyft, Slack, and a number of other companies. This happened very quickly, and it was not a good thing for those companies. So next one is the Poisoned Pipeline Execution, or PPE. It's a funny name, but this is like the Trojan horse. So there's two different types of PPE with poisoned pipeline execution. There's direct and indirect, right? Like let's say we have a CI/CD pipeline, like GitHub Actions. Well, you could either, if the access controls are not set up properly, someone could go modify those directly, modify the steps, and insert steps that could do malicious actions. What the indirect one is that a lot of times these pipelines will run, but then they'll run some bash script or something else, right? So indirect is when you modify the scripts that the pipeline uses when it's running. So you go in there and you modify, the bash script, and the bash script will do something malicious. So you want to prevent both of those. And how do you do that? Is first of all understanding it and making sure that you put, that every change to the pipeline configuration is monitored, or the scripts as well, right? So the scripts that are used, they should go through rigorous code reviews and a lot of scrutiny, and we need to make sure that our systems are configured to prevent unauthorized modifications. Also, you should restrict workflow execution for external PRs, right? So what happens is, let's say you got a project and you accept external pull requests. Within that pull request, maybe someone is modifying your YAML file. It's an interesting fact that modification doesn't even have to be checked in. The modifications will run within the pipeline without even being checked in. You can use branch protection rules to prevent that from permanently being checked in. So you can say, hey, for the master branch or for this branch, I'm not letting these changes to be permanently committed. But that's all about the future. But at that time, when they're doing that pull request, if they've modified the YAML file, the changes will actually happen in real time. And then the other thing you should do is limit secret access for forked PRs. You got to make sure that secrets are not accessible to workflows that are triggered by PR forks or untrusted sources. And I'm going to talk a bit more about access control in a minute. And as always, I'll just repeat this, that learn from the history, right? Like look at these, talk to your team, and make sure that these things don't happen to you and your product and your environment. All right, so let's see if there's anything forgotten. Yeah, so we talked about GitHub Actions. I mean, this can happen with many pipelines, Jenkins. Just out of curiosity, how many of you use Jenkins? Okay, some people. GitHub Actions? Okay, it's a good mix. Other CI/CD platforms? Okay, there's a lot of them, right? The two most popular ones are, well, Jenkins has been around for a long time, GitHub Actions. We also see a lot of our clients use Azure DevOps pipelines. There's a Team City, the list goes on, but those are some of the popular ones, that Circle CI, et cetera, et cetera. But all these things can happen to any of those CI/CD platforms. So direct versus indirect, right? I hope that's clear. The direct is when they go in and directly modify the pipeline. through the access that they have. Indirect is they modify the artifacts that are used by the pipeline, like bash scripts and things like that. All right, so number 5. So what's this one about? So this one is about pipeline-based access controls, right? It's a little bit different than identity access management. It's kind of similar. Identity access management is a bit more broad. So, as we talked about in the first example, hey, you got to enforce MFA, you got to make sure that, your passwords are strong and things like that. But then when you get into the nitty-gritty, you can actually have access control in different steps in your pipeline, and you got to make sure that that's really set up properly, because if one particular step, the access control is not configured properly, then that could be used maliciously by the attackers. So it's really important to understand this as, this is a pretty important security measure. Think of it like, think of PBAC like the permissions on a highly sensitive project, right? It dictates who can do what, making sure that only authorized personnel can make changes or trigger deployments. So what can we learn from all this stuff? So you got to distinguish between PBAC and IAM. But let's talk about the code cov breach again, right? So with the code cov breach, remember what I said is that they went to that Docker container and got those credentials, and then they were able to go and log in where the bash uploader script was. Well, why did those credentials have so much permission? Like, if all you need to do with that Docker container is pull the bash uploader script, why did those credentials have read and write permissions, right? If you'd have enforced the right access control, then that wouldn't have happened. In that case, those credentials should have only given access, read-only access, so the container could download the bash uploader script rather than giving someone the ability to modify that uploader script. So that was a bad thing, and it highlighted a huge gap in what authenticated users can or can't do. So what can you learn from this? Well, you gotta have your PBACs defined. It's about implementing detailed access controls specifically for your CI/CD pipelines, and complementing the broader IAM policies at your organization. And we talked about that case study, and always make sure that you got your access control. Environment segmentation is also really important. This is one thing we talk to our clients a lot. So you got to make sure that if you have an environment that is for your build or staging or pre-production, that you're using those pipelines, that there's that segregation. And even within steps, like what each step could do, you should put strict access controls around that. So environment segmentation limits sensitive secrets to specific pipeline steps. Then you should also scope the secrets in a limited way. So restrict the secrets to specific steps or jobs within the pipeline, and also external secrets management. So use secure tools to store and retrieve secrets, and then of course have approval gates for external dependencies. Require validation for third-party scripts before you use them. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're good. Halfway through time. So number 6 is the next one we're going to talk about. Credential hygiene, right? Make sure that you know where the secrets are. I remember that thing from the 90s or 80s, you know where your children are, right? So do you know where your secrets are? Not everyone does. CodeCov did not know that there were secrets in that Docker container. I don't know how that went through, how that got past them, but it's really important to know where your secrets are, how you're managing them, and prevent credential sprawl. So this is often overlooked, and it's a pretty critical aspect of your CI/CD security posture. Imagine your CI/CD environment is a vault. Now, if the keys to this vault are scattered all over the place, how secure can our vault really be, right? So you need to make sure that that's taken care of. Talked about CodeCov. Let's talk about Travis CI. I just also want to know how many people have heard of Travis CI. Okay, good. That's awesome. So what happened in September 2019? Someone found out that the build logs contained pretty sensitive credentials, right? So as you know, when you run the build, there's a bunch of logs, right? And then those logs, Travis CI was logging credentials in a way that would be accessible to other people. So they fixed it, right? They fixed it. And then a similar problem popped up again for them in later in 2021. So it's kind of embarrassing for them, for this to have not fixed it properly. It's a slightly different problem how they exposed the secrets the second time, but it's a reminder that when you fix things in security, make sure you do it right the first time. And in their case, they didn't do it right the first time. They fixed it in one place and then exposed the secrets in another. So that's a lesson learned from there. And so what do you do? How do you avoid this from happening to you? How do you avoid these pitfalls? you got to start with knowing where our secrets are and who has access to them. Regular audit and rotation is really important. So yes, it shouldn't have been in the logs, but if you're rotating, if it ended up in the logs, the rotation would have helped from people having long-term access to those, using those keys. So yeah, that's important. Make sure you have scoped access. So make sure that each secret is only accessible by the tasks and things that need to, by the parts of the pipeline that need it. It's like giving out the keys that only open certain doors, right? So you don't want to make sure that the key opens every door. And you got to also use dynamic secrets, use short-lived dynamic credentials that reduce the window of opportunity for the attacker, right? That's really important. And education. So education and tools. Make sure that you empower your teams with knowledge and tools and things they need to be able to prevent this type of thing from happening, including using secret scanning tools and enforcing policies against hard-coding secrets in the code. It's an interesting thing about logs. I mean, in this particular case, you should never put, that should not have been exposed in the bid logs. But taking that whole log discussion more broadly, I talk to folks and they're like, oh, well, can't I just log secrets in an encrypted way? It's like, no, I mean, you should just not put secrets in any format in logs, right? Encrypted or not. De-identify them, scramble them, something that is not reversible to the attackers. And, again, learning from this, right? So sit down with your team, dissect this, and then make sure that everyone understands what happened and implement the controls appropriately. You got to make sure that both these Travis CI and the CodeCov incidents, they teach us the importance of not just securing the secrets, but also making sure that our CI/CD tools and processes, that they're configured in a way to prevent unauthorized access or leakage, in essence by tightening the grip on how we manage credentials within our CI/CD pipelines. We make sure that we safeguard our digital assets appropriately and fortifying our defenses like a castle. And it's all about layered defense, right? I mean, I keep talking about this almost regularly, is that security is not just about putting one control in place. One control might slow down the attacker, but when you put multiple controls together, then you can hopefully prevent them. And I said hopefully because security is never 100%. One of the first things I learned when I went into this field was that don't ever tell anyone that I've made sure that this is 100% secure. That's the biggest mistake you could make. Because as Bruce Schneier said, your systems will fail at some point. And if you're successful, if you can manage the blast radius. So don't say, this is 100% secure. Assume that it will fail at some point and make sure you have the right controls that when the things blow up, that it doesn't blow up too far and too badly on you. All right, number 7. So Nissan, yeah, nice cars, right? They make pretty nice cars, but an oops moment happened to them. So this is really about hardening your system. So they put out they were using their own Git server, right? Just like PHP did. And these guys didn't even harden it at all. And they put it in a public network. At a public IP address, no hardening, right? So you can imagine it's pretty easy to compromise. And that's exactly what happened. They got compromised and their source code got exposed. So sure, they make really nice, pretty cars, but they definitely didn't take care of their code that is used and could be pretty critical to the operation of the cars. So how do we avoid finding yourselves in a similar situation? I mean, I think a lot of you would think that this is pretty simple, right? Like if you roll out your own Git server, hardening. I mean, when I first got into security in the late 90s and early 2000s, the first thing I was told is read the hardening guides, right? Like in the 90s, there were all these how-tos. And I remember I downloaded the how-to hardening guide for whatever it was, databases, all the things that Apache, all the things I was rolling out. I was taught that at an early stage. These guys rolled it out, zero hardening, and furthermore, they put it in a public network. Why would you do that? So anyways, I digress, but make sure that you use secure default settings. So challenge and change the default configuration. That's something that was instilled in me right from the beginning. Whenever I install something, I go through every option. I don't pick, just default settings and let it go install quickly, which a lot of people do. I'll go through the manual setup and I'll check every single thing and make sure that I understand what it does and I've configured it optimally in security. Then the other thing, as a side note, is don't put it, network access control, right? Don't put this on the public internet. I see that with Jenkins as well. We have clients that have rolled out their own Jenkins server and they just put it on the public internet. And even Jenkins, Atlassian says that is not something you should do. There's actually a project, a proxy for Jenkins that you put in front of it so that it's more secure and people can't send payloads to it directly. And speaking of proxies, I forgot to mention another thing. We remember we were talking about dependency confusion. So yeah, we make sure that you're using your own internal artifact repository, but also put a proxy. We were having this conversation yesterday with some colleagues, and that topic came up. And I think it's really important because that proxy will also look at what's coming and what's going out and helping you with further security. Now, in addition to hardening, you should also do regular audit on your system, right? Updates, audit. It's not, okay, well, I hardened it. But yeah, things change. There's new patches, updates, and all that kind of stuff. If you're rolling out your own, be prepared to do all that, right? Or don't and use GitHub. A few years ago, the argument would have been, well, GitHub doesn't encrypt my data, et cetera, et cetera. GitHub Enterprise did. Oh, that's too expensive. But nowadays, even regular GitHub will encrypt your data. So it's not the case anymore. Like when I worked at HSBC, I remember we looked at GitHub and we didn't do it because at that time they didn't provide encryption. But now they do, right? So there are not that many excuses left not to use something like GitHub. But if you do want to roll your own, that's totally fine. Just make sure you take care of the things we're talking about today. And then, as a secondary, I should mention that principal of least privilege is always really important. It's one of those principles that come up almost in everything. So whenever you're setting something up, make sure you've done your review and make sure that people only have access to things they should have access to. Right? It's really important. And I'm going to repeat this again, education and awareness, right? So go through these things, learn them, dissect them, and understand them, and foster a culture of security awareness. That's really important. A lot of people, they come out of college, university, they may not have been trained for security. I wasn't, right? I started building software right out of university. I just went in there, and all the bad things happened to me. I actually love teaching, because when I teach, I have a lot of real-world examples. I remember was it 2001? I'd followed all the best practices. We had a DMZ, internal subnet for our database server. But what happened is we didn't have enough budget, so my management only bought one tape backup, which was connected to both, the front end and the back end. So the database dump was on that tape backup. The attackers breached the front end server, got the database dump. They renamed it to index.html, and you can imagine what happened. So I got a call at 6 in the morning. Hey, when you go to our company website, you can see everyone's addresses, credit card numbers, and everything about them, right? I have lots of stories. If you want to talk to me, come after, we can chat. But don't let those things happen to you. And I wasn't educated on all of these, right? And I would go and read up about them. I remember after that, I was like, well, okay, I'm going to do this differently. It was another instance where there was another compromise, things got exposed, and I rolled out encryption. But you know what I did? I went on the internet and read about, this was 2000 or 2001, or in that era, went and read about encryption. I'm like, oh, there's this thing RC4. And there was a how-to, and then what language did I use? In Perl. I wrote up my own RC4. Horrible idea, right? But I didn't know that you should never write your own encryption, and you should use someone else's library, and RC4 is not a good thing, right? So yeah, make sure you're educated, that there's awareness, and people know that they should do the right thing. And it's not always easy as well. We had this conversation over lunch as well. How do you train your team, right? Is it they do they take some courses, you do online presentations, you in person? I think it's a combination of those. They each have their own benefits. If you do a in-person one-time training, well, what happens between those 12 months? What if there's a new employee that joins your company? So you got to augment it with self-paced learning and all kinds of other things, but it's really important to do that education and to send them to these kinds of conferences so that they can learn from all the great talks that are happening here. And I digress. So we'll go to the next one. Number 8, another oops. So what happened is usage of third-party services. So we'll pick on Deep Source for this one. So a lot of us are using a lot of third-party services. How many of us are actually going and seeing, hey, what are these companies' practices? Right? Are they doing secure software development? Are they doing XYZ? Do they do pen testing on their application? So do your part, and before you integrate something in your CI/CD pipelines, make sure that that third-party risk is managed and you know what you're getting yourself into. So in the case of Deep Source, someone compromised one of their GitHub users, and then using those credentials, they modified the source code, and then that Deep Source is a static analysis tool, right? How many people have heard of Deep Source? Okay, a few people, right? Does static analysis on your code. And so when they modified that modified code ran on all their clients and was able to grab very sensitive information from those clients and send it back to Deep Source. So, that's a pretty notable example. As I mentioned, they compromised the GitHub account, and it's a bit of a wake-up call. So you got to safeguard against it. But how do we do that? Have a thorough vetting process. The larger enterprises have the third-party risk team and things like that. But sometimes I find even that's a bit of a lip service. Like I know places I've worked, the third-party risk people, they didn't really fully understand security. They had a checklist and they would just go tick, 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 yep, the third party has these and great, right? They weren't really going and looking at their reputation, the processes, or digging deep into any of those kinds of things. So just because your company has a TPR, third-party risk team or whatever they call it, just because you have that, it doesn't mean that it's been done. It might not be a bad idea if you're rolling out something like Deep Source for you to do a bit of investigation, but sometimes, again, as I said, it's not 100%. Even if you do all of that, bad things can still happen. And sometimes the companies are not going to disclose certain details that might be important to the way the attack pans out. So do the vetting process where you can. And then I'm going to repeat the principle of least privilege, right? As I said, that's one of the most important ones. So make sure that if you are using a third-party product, that you're limiting what they have access to, how far they can go, and things like that, right? If you're doing static analysis, maybe make sure that the deep source agent has permission to is limited to specific parts of your pipeline and things like that. And then do a continuous monitoring. So regularly audit the access and activities of those third-party services. Right? I'm going to talk about logging in a bit here, but logging is often something that's left out. I remember at the bank, I went to the application team and said, "Hey, are you guys logging?" They're like, "What are you talking about?" "Yeah, we do application logs." I'm like, "No, I'm not talking about application logs. I'm talking about security logs." They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, "Well, you got to log success and failure of authentication, failure of access control, failure of input validation, failure of deserialization." They'd never even heard of that, right? So if you're not looking at those, people could be tinkering with your system and doing things until they succeed. And if you are monitoring, then you can notice those indication of compromise and do something about it. So it's really important to have that. And then it's important to have an emergency plan. So have a good response plan in case something bad happens with your third party, that you can act on it appropriately and quickly. And this deep source incident serves as a critical reminder of the importance of maintaining strict access control oversight of third-party services in our CI/CD pipelines. So, number 9, artifact integrity validation. Trust but verify. So we're going to pick on CodeCov again for this one. So, in the discussion of improper artifact integrity validation, let's take a look at the CodeCov again. So what could have happened there? So they went and modified that bash uploader script, right? There's no integrity checks on that container done at all. Now, so if they'd done that, they would have noticed that, hey, something got modified, this doesn't match, et cetera, et cetera. But it shouldn't also be a one-time event, right? Like, okay, so you check the integrity today and that's it. You're going to leave it forever? What if it got changed? What if something got changed tomorrow? So it should be a continuous process, and that's what's really important that's one of the important key takeaways of that. So, we gotta make sure that we're checking in the CodeCov example, the integrity of that Docker image, or if anything had changed, and not just doing that once, but doing it over time regularly, because security isn't static, right? Security is dynamic, it's ongoing. It's an ongoing commitment. So you got to do continuous validation, and that means that you got to constantly monitor your artifacts for integrity, making sure they haven't been tampered with since you put them out there into the pipeline. And this approach requires integrating tools that continuously scan and alert on discrepancies, ensuring that artifacts remain secure and authentic from the point of their use all the way through. And also, to further fortify the pipeline, start with widespread adoption of digital signatures if you can for artifacts, making sure that each component can be verified as authentic. And you got to incorporate continuous monitoring. And of course, awareness and preparedness are pretty important as well to prevent similar breaches, right? Goes back to having a conversation with your team on a weekly basis, right? As I said, we used to have team meetings every week. Now we do them every 2 weeks, but we allocate a good 10, 15 minutes of that team meeting to talk about current news, like what happened in the last couple of weeks, what can we learn from them, and how do we implement that in our environment. So what else do I want to say about this? Yeah, if you prioritize continuous validation and do all these things in your artifact management, then hopefully bad stuff will not happen to you. All right, number 10, insufficient logging and visibility, flying blind. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies aren't logging things properly with applications or even maybe the CI/CD pipelines. So let's talk about that for a minute and why it's important to keep an eye on our pipelines. The truth is that the longer you let someone poke at your system, the more successful they'll be, right? Who remembers the Marriott and Starwood attack a number of years ago, right? The attackers were doing reconnaissance for 2 years, is what I read somewhere. 2 years is a long time to go unnoticed. Why were they not logging and monitoring those things to raise some alerts that people are poking at your systems, right? So the more time you give them, eventually they'll be successful. Right? Like I said, if there's a will, there's a way. Security is not 100%. They will figure it out at some point. So it's super important to do the logging and monitoring. And imagine, why quick detection matters. So every minute an attacker goes unnoticed, they're able to dig deeper into our systems, and it makes it harder to kick them out, right? I think in the case of that Marriott Starwood, they'd actually gotten access internally, and they were trying to figure out where the databases are and what they do and things like that. So and of course with the Travis CI slip up, where sensitive environment variables got leaked, this shows us just how easy it is for things to go south when we're not looking closely enough. And of course those unauthorized commits in the PHP Git server, that's also a really good example. So if you're noticing things that are happening that are abnormal, you should be alerting on those events. And so how do we beef up our night vision, if you will? So first of all, log things, start from there. And then don't just leave them there. So after, in my bank example, after I talked to the dev team, they're like, okay, well, we're gonna log things. I'm like, okay, where are those logs? They're like, oh, we just leave them on the server. Okay, how long do they stay there for? I don't know, until they're rotated. Okay, so the security team didn't have visibility. They were not centralized. And then when the attacker breaks into your system, they can delete them. And that's what happened. Remember I told you guys we got compromised at that company that I worked at in the late 90s, early 2000s? So when they did that breach, we brought this forensics guy. He worked for some US military or something. He was pretty expensive. I think we paid like 80 grand to fly him up and do all the forensics. And at the end, he was like, there's not much I can tell you because there's no logs. I'm like, what happened to the logs? They're like, oh, they got deleted because the logs were on that server and they just wiped them out, right? There were no centralization. So I went to the ISP, the place that we're co-locating this. This is before the cloud, right? So we had a co-location server, paying a lot of money. And they told us, oh yeah, we're logging stuff in the firewall. We're logging stuff over there. And when I asked them for those logs, you know what they said? Oh, well, this was during the .com blow up. And they're like, oh yeah, we've laid off all the staff and we don't know what's going on. And there were no logs for us. So make sure the logs are somewhere, they can't be deleted, and monitor them regularly and alert appropriately. So that's important, so that all these things are a good reminder for us to make sure that we stay vigilant. And in summary, getting our logging and visibility up to snuff means that we're not just reacting to threats after they've done their damage, that we're setting up the floodlights and security cameras, making sure that our pipelines are a place where attackers have nowhere to hide, right? You don't want to have dark places where they can hide and get away with things. So I got the 5-minute warning, and this is a great time for conclusion and QA. I'm going to do a quick conclusion, so let's recap. So recap of our journey. What did we talk about? We talked about a bunch of critical insights from notable breaches. We talked about SolarWinds. I talked a lot about CodeCov, Travis CI, PHP, Nissan, Deep Source. All these things should be reminders that this could also happen to you and your company. Learn about the OWASP Top 10 CI/CD. Check out the Secure Pipeline Verification Standard. We're going to launch our website is now officially up, and we're going to post it on LinkedIn and all kinds of stuff. And come talk to us. Cam's here. Iman is also. And by the way, my colleague Iman also here. He's one of the main contributors to the OWASP Application Security, ASVS Application Security Verification Standard. So yeah, if you have questions, come talk to us. Have concrete actions for pipeline security, right? Make sure you do a comprehensive audit. As a starting point, take this OWASP Top 10 Security Risks, or the draft SPVS that'll come out soon, and go and check and see if you're incorporating those practices, and more importantly, embrace continuous improvement. Make sure you recognize that this isn't a one-time thing. I'm just going to, oh, hey, I did this today and that's it, right? It's a continuous journey. So you got to make sure that you're taking care of those throughout. And that's it. Questions, please.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. And I have a question. Can we consider, or should we consider developers' machine as a part of CI/CD pipeline or not?
I'm smiling and laughing at Cam over there. It depends on what your definition of pipelines are. So if you're just talking about CI/CD itself, right? Like we had this conversation, I think it was yesterday over lunch. If you're talking about just CI/CD, okay, that's your Jenkins. But if you're talking about software development pipelines, it extends further beyond CI/CD, right? The pipeline starts with that developer's machine. So I think in the SPVS, we have controls for that, right? Because Jeff Williams defines that software factory, including that developer, because the factory is everything. It's like the person that's working there, the machines, the automations, there's all the things that build that, let's say car factory, right? The car is the output, the factory is all the things that build that car. So in the case of software, well, the car is the application you're building, but all the things that go into building it, that can be considered your pipelines, including the developer. And in fact, when COVID happened, a lot of people started working from home. That became a problem. Why? Because developers had laptops that may not have been hardened. Everyone started using their own machines, and they're at home working on a network that's not segmented. Their kids upstairs downloading all kinds of things, probably malware. That computer's infected, and you're in the same household, and then it's going to attack the developer's computer, right? When I worked at HSBC, what they did is they did split tunneling and a bunch of other things. So when you were connected to the HSBC, you could only do VPN, and when you were connected, it disabled access to your local network. It was kind of annoying because I couldn't even print stuff to my home printer, but I guess it was good because if I'm working at home and there's other people with other computers that have vulnerability, it couldn't go through my computer and get access to everything. So there are important controls that you should consider around the developer's machine, especially given that everyone's working from home these days, right? If you can, segment your network where you're working. Yes, please.
So you spent like a minute on the last point talking about the importance of logs.
Sorry, can you speak up?
You spent a minute and talking about the importance of logs. So like given like recent news about like Microsoft, like if you were a Microsoft like CTO or something, how worried would you be about like losing that like 2 weeks ago?
So I don't know if I understood that question. So you were talking about if you were Microsoft. Can you paraphrase that?
There was some news about how Microsoft lost like 2 weeks of security logs. So that's like if you were in their shoes, like what would you be doing right now?
So they lost 2 weeks. Oh, they lost logs. Oh, that's what you're saying. Okay, if I lost my logs, what would I do? In my case, if I lost my, because in that example I provided, they deleted our logs. What would I do without logs? It was difficult because there wasn't a lot that we could do because it was like, well, we don't know what happened here. So we tried to make assumptions. Oh, maybe it was this or maybe it was that, but we never knew with certainty. Had we had logs, I mean, your logs should be centralized. They should be immutable, right? There was another case where it was the Bank of Bangladesh heist that I got involved. It was a nightmare. What had happened is they went and deleted they went and actually modified the log files, so they removed their activity. But the bank was actually smart, so they also had a printer. So not only did they log it digitally, they also printed them. But you know what they did is they went to the Windows drive, because the printer was connected to a Windows machine. They disabled the registry, that DLL for that thing, and then the printer didn't even print the logs. So logs are really important. You got to make sure they're immutable, they're stored somewhere, they can't be deleted or modified, all that kind of stuff. And if you didn't have them, I don't know what you could do.
There's a Darknet Diaries
Yes.
episode about the bank.
If you haven't listened to that, you listen to it. I was on vacation and I came back and then I worked at HSBC. Boss was like, hey, while you were away, this happened.